Now, one of the problems we have when we look at the books of the Bible is that some of them repeat the same things. There's a lot of repetition in the Bible. There are two stories of creation, one in Genesis 1, the other in Genesis 2. And then you get in the middle of the Old Testament the books of Kings and the books of Chronicles, all of which cover the same history of Israel. And when you turn to the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels of Jesus, and all telling us about the life of Jesus. Why 4? Well, these repetitions have a purpose. And I'll give you the clue to the Kings and Chronicles overlap. Kings was written by a prophet, and Chronicles by a priest. And one was written before the exile when they were taken to Babylon, and the other was written afterwards. And that's why they're different. When the prophet wrote the history of Israel, he told them all the bad things that Israel had done, which had deserved the exile, and why God had punished them. So you get David and Bathsheba there, and that dreadful business, and all the bad kings of Israel. But when Chronicles describes the same history, it highlights the good things in Israel. Because when they came back from Israel, a whole generation had died. And they needed to recover 3 things, which they were in danger of losing because of the gap. First, they needed to recover their sense of belonging. They needed to be given a long family tree, a genealogy from Adam right through to their day. And that's why the first few chapters of Chronicles are all the begats. And they now knew their roots. And it's awfully good to know your roots. You've had an amazing example of a black man here in America who's written a book called Roots, been made into a film. And he dug back into his African roots. And you find your identity when you know your roots, when you know where you've come from. It helps you to know where you're going. And so the first thing they needed when they came back from exile was to know their roots. And so they got 6 chapters of all those names, which are not in the book of Kings, but they cover the same period. The next thing they needed to recover was their royalty. They'd had a king until they went into exile, and now they must rediscover the royal line of David. And so Chronicles tells them where that royal line now is, so that they can look forward to having a king again. And the other thing they really needed to find again was their religion. And so Chronicles tells us the history of the religion of Israel. It's the same period of history as Kings, but it's for quite a different purpose. And now, when you read those 2 books, you won't ask questions as to why the 2 books cover the same history. Entirely different point of view. And that's the clue to overlap, even to the 4 Gospels, which overlap with each other. And there are things that are repeated in at least 3 of the Gospels. And you wonder why. Why couldn't God give us one Gospel to read the story of Jesus in one go? And some people have tried to put the 4 Gospels into one story. It's a very difficult task. It was tried for the first time about 1,000 years ago. And a detective novel writer in my town of Guildford in England, he tried it. And he wrote many detective stories, but one book was called The 4 Gospels in One Story, and he put it together. But it makes a mess. Because we need 4 Gospels to look at Jesus from 4 different angles. You get a fuller picture of someone when you get a different aspect of their character and their activity. Broadly speaking, Matthew presents Jesus as King of the Jews. Mark presents Jesus as Son of Man. Luke presents Jesus as Savior of the world. And John presents Jesus as Son of God. And that gives you a lovely total picture of Jesus in at least 4 of his functions. But there's more to it than that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels because synoptic means sun, together, optic, look. And synoptic gospels look at Jesus from a similar point of view. And they look at Jesus from the outside, whereas John's gospel looks at Jesus from the inside. And that's the main reason why it's so different. And now you can read the 4 Gospels in a different way, but I'm going to say more. Of the 4 Gospels, 2 are written for unbelievers, and 2 are written for believers. And the 2 written for believers, one is written for young believers, new believers, and the other is written for old believers, mature believers. Now, do you know which? You can give the wrong gospel to an unbeliever. Well, now, which 2 are written for unbelievers? Mark and Luke. And Mark tells them what Jesus did, and Luke tells them, in addition to Mark, what Jesus said. And then finally, John came along and talked about what Jesus was. When a great person dies, interest in them goes through 2 phases, 3 phases. The first, the obituary notice, will simply list what the person did. And then people begin to be interested in what they said, and their speeches and letters get published. And then the third phase is when people write a book really getting into the guy and telling us from the inside what he was. And you get this progression in the 4 Gospels. Mark told us what God did. Matthew and Luke added in what Jesus said. And then John tells us what Jesus was. The mature look at Jesus that we have in the Gospel of John was written last. Now, Mark and Luke are written for unbelievers. Matthew is written for new believers. And John is written for old believers. And the same parable in 2 different Gospels carry a different message. Take the parable of the lost sheep. It occurs in Matthew and Luke. But in Luke, the lost sheep is a lost unbeliever who needs to be found. But in Matthew, the lost sheep is a lost believer who needs to be brought back. In Luke, the parable of the great feast is for unbelievers to be invited to come and take their place at the feast. But in Matthew, the emphasis is on the man who didn't change his clothes and was thrown out of the feast at the end. For many are called, but few are chosen at the end. So you see, even the same parable of Jesus, which he obviously told on more than one occasion, has a different message because of the books in which they occur, which are aimed at different people. And Matthew, of course, was not only aimed at new believers, but new Jewish believers, and has a particular approach for them. So 4 Gospels, all different, and you will only understand what is in each Gospel when you know who it was written for and why it was written. And then that Gospel will have more meaning for you.